Can you tell me, what do you see as the biggest hurdle in drug repurposing today?
Yep, it's a terrific question. I think that the biggest hurdle related to repurposing is really the sharing of knowledge from the pharmaceutical industry across a regulatory firewall to the research and the development side of the house. I think that there's about 3,000 drugs indicated in the market for about 20,000 indications. And the knowledge inside of the pharmaceutical organizations is really all we need to know about drug repurposing. So we need to process that knowledge, but there's regulatory restrictions to doing so. So I think that innovation really needs to happen on the policy side of the house versus the technology side of the house. The technology today is phenomenal to identify repurposing candidates. The problem is that a lot of that knowledge is already locked up inside of what you would call really market access issues around regulatory restrictions for pursuing new drugs and the expensive nature of clinical trials in relation to getting those drugs approved.
I guess what you're saying then is, like, we know what the drugs are and we have the technology to identify probably additional indications if the biopharma companies don't already know where else they would go. But there's this issue with basically every drug needs to go through the full process, right? And so you have to go through this long, expensive regulatory cascade essentially every single time in order to get something new to the market and approved.
Yes. To break it down, I mean, you have a 17-year patent life. The average drug gets to market at about the 10-year mark. So you have 7 years, and it's actually maybe 10 to 11 years now. So you have 6 to 7 years of active marketing before it goes generic. Once it goes generic, everything changes. The price comes way down. Manufacturing gets done by a whole bunch of companies and generics and other things. So companies oftentimes will have a molecule that gets to market that has many possible solutions, but they have to pursue one of them. Being profit-driven, much like pharmaceutical companies are, they'll generally pursue the biggest indication that a drug can have an effect on the population, or quite frankly, sometimes the most meaningful, like in oncology. So you might have a molecule. Rheumatoid molecules have a huge spectrum of indications, is a good example, actually. And oftentimes they'll get pursued for a large indication, and there's a lot of small indications that they just never get marketed for. So all of that potential sits on the shelf, essentially, in the pharmaceutical company. So we need to find a way to loosen that up and bring it to market. And I can talk about some ideas for that.
Bob, I'd love to talk about that. You know, one of the things that also strikes me is, and I guess this may be kind of a question, and as you think about kind of the efforts here in this space, do we really need to go down that pathway? Or are there, you know, particularly as we start thinking about maybe some of the other generic molecules out there, are we able to learn from things like the real world data or the other experiences of organizations, right, enough that we would actually be able to get some of these molecules to the right people who need them, right? And so it feels to me like we just have more and more knowledge, and there's a very formal kind of set piece process that people go through. And then there's hey, the drug's been in the market, maybe it's even cheap, but maybe it can save somebody's life. Like, how do we identify that opportunity as well?
For sure, there's two other huge repositories of knowledge. One is physician knowledge. So 65% in the U.S. of all drugs that get prescribed are prescribed what they call off-label, which means they're not indicated for the things they got approved for. So that means that physicians know that they're effective for certain things. And then also patient knowledge. Patients do phenomenal things with drugs, right? Because they know what works. So oftentimes they know what dosages work, and they know what certain drugs are good for other things. All of that knowledge is really unleveraged at this point in time. I should say that physician off-label prescribing knowledge For instance, most famously, drugs like Viagra and Cialis, they were heart medication drugs. And one of the side effects was erectile. So they got indicated for erectile dysfunction. So that's a perfect example but that indication was big enough that the pharmaceutical companies were able to pursue it. So that's how that class of drugs really got discovered. It's a great example.
If we have all the technology, right? So we have the AI, right? We have the real world data. We have different statistical methods for doing analysis, meta-analysis, et cetera. So we can pick up where the drugs work. We have biological information, right? Which is being stored in the pharma companies from their own R&D efforts, right? Their own exploration of the molecules itself. How do we share this information, Bob? Is that part of the problem here? Like, just like nobody, to your point, I think you're saying it's kind of just locked up and siloed away so that, it's just not general knowledge.
Yes. We need to have kind of some safe harbor provisions, if you will, in the policy area where pharmaceutical companies can share the data to both regulators and, quite frankly, to each other. I don't want to get the number wrong, but I think it's 2 or 3 drugs have been actually invented inside of pharmaceutical companies. With GLP-1s, it might be actually more like a half dozen now. So most of the stuff that comes to market comes through bench research. But once it gets acquired by a pharmaceutical company, you stop having open access data information, right? Because the bench research is basically open access, most funded in the US by the NIH. So we need to find a way to let pharmaceutical companies share knowledge between each other and also to regulators and to other individuals that want to pursue niche indications. And I think we need to have a financial instrument where we let pharmaceutical companies still carry the R&D and the development costs of their drugs somehow on their balance sheet. So when they let a niche indication go and let someone else pursue it for drug repurposing, it won't erode their main market, if you will.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I was talking to another friend of mine about this, and he was actually trying to license drugs that he thought had different purposes from pharmaceutical companies. Where they would find something and they would know who holds the IP and they would go and try and license it. And he was telling me that even when it's failed, right, there was often a lot of hesitance, right, to even try to bring it back off the shelf. So it's essentially sitting there as a wasted asset, but it was primarily due to the cost or exposure, right, that someone would encounter around that. There didn't seem to be a financial incentive, to your point, right, to bring those back to market.
That's right. There's actually a financial disincentive. I can give you another just classic industry example. It's the Avastin Lucentis issue. Avastin, it was a very famous and incredibly successful oncology drug for breast cancer. And the vial size, it was about $1,200 for oncologists to buy. They would oftentimes put it into a chemo cocktail. And the exact same drug was also very effective for macular degeneration related to diabetes and to patients that had macular degeneration and the various causes of it. So they released it for ophthalmologists and retinal docs for injection into the eye. Half the vial size, and it was $50 a vial. So what was happening, and by the way, cured macular degeneration for the most part. Couple shots in the eye, I think, per year. I'm not sure exactly the dosage regimen, but it worked. And they did a great job. It was actually Genentech and Roche. And what happened is the oncologist always wanted a different vial size than the $1,200 vial size. But that was the one that got approved through the regulatory channels and all the other things that I talked about. And the true expense of getting it to market, right? We give a lot of criticism for drug development. Without pharmaceutical companies, you wouldn't have, a lot of innovation because they take the risk of manufacturing and regulatory and trials and all the other things. So what happened is oncologists were buying 2 of the vials for macular degeneration, and they weren't buying the $1,200 Avastin vial size. So what happened is the mac degeneration one got pulled off market. It was a terrible thing. I guess patients that could have afforded the $1,200 vial size and it, by the way, it doesn't get billed then through insurance if it's not approved. So probably still did it. But by and large, most of the patients were not eligible for the shot. So it's one of the great travesties of this regulatory problem that I'm talking about.
It was really driven by the differential reimbursement for the indication use, where the oncology indication was super high value, right? Because it's cancer versus the macular degeneration, which is still valuable. It just isn't comparable, really, right?
That's right. Niche disease versus a larger disease.